Psychological research suggests that people value experiences not by the duration or consistency, but by how they felt at their emotional peak and how they ended, a phenomenon known as the peak end rule. Hello, I'm Jerome, a student at Princeton University studying philosophy, behavioral science, and endings. Subsequent work confirms that people will prefer an objectively longer and more painful experience if it ends slightly better than a shorter one. Empirical studies even demonstrated that people rate an entire life as better if it ends at a peak, even if it's objectively shorter or contains less total well-being. When we look back on our lives, or even on a single experience, we do not average what happened. We compress it. We remember how it felt at its most intense moment and how it ended. This insight has been celebrated as one of the greatest discoveries of memory and behavioral science. And it is. Psychologically, this makes sense. Memory requires compression. However, the ethical risk occurs when this compression is mistaken for truth and judgment. What begins as a cognitive efficiency could become misleading. If the ending is good, the experience was good. Memory is manipulated, the past changed. And when this memory bias becomes a moral habit or normative social behavior, it begins to shape not just how we remember lives, but how we judge it. Because when that happens, something essential is missing. Research on temporal perception helps explain why our endings gain more weight. Hirschfield shows that people experience time as a different series of successive presents, and that sharply bounded presence bias attention toward closure rather than duration. The Pekin rule kind of makes the assumption that duration barely matters. Long stretches of effort, patience, or care fade into the background if the ending is weak. Conversely, a powerful ending can retroactively redeem years of neglect. Later research, through meta-analysis, confirms that this effect appears robust across domains, from pain perception to consumer satisfaction to emotional judgment. Memory, it turns out, could prefer intelligible, spontaneous stories over remembering the boring daily moral work. Daniel Kahneman explains this through the distinction between experiencing self and the remembering self. The experiencing self lives minute by minute. The remembering self tells the story afterward, and stories need endings. But here's the tension. Ethics is lived by the experiencing self, while judgment is dominated by the remembering one. The remembering self prefers endings because endings make stories intelligible. What it overlooks is that most of life and most of moral work happens in the middle. So I want to slow us down and ask what kinds of lives and what kinds of care may be overlooked when endings and peace overshine moral work. To explore the question, we can turn to the concept of filial piety, or xiao. Xiao is durational by definition. The Analects and Mencius consistently frame xiao as a lifelong practice of attentiveness, emotional regulation, material support, and ritual respect to elders, performed not at moments, but through sustained everyday presence. Crucially, xiao is not evaluated by how one performs at end of a parent's life, but by whether one's conduct over time reflects sincerity, patience, and presence. What matters is not how one performs at a funeral, but on a random Tuesday. Filial piety is, in many ways, a balanced moral theory, and that makes it a powerful counterpoint to the peak end rule. Using filial piety, or xiao, as a cultural and ethical lens to understand endings and the peak end rule, this is the claim I want to put onto this table. Beyond its distortion of memory, the peak end rule replaces the value of consistent effort and moral responsibility with the subjective metrics of peaks or end results. thereby incentivizing performative practices and filial piety. Since participating in peaks and endings provide people the opportunity to be remembered, it becomes a shortcut to gain disproportionate moral authority, often overriding years of lived experiences. They compress years of complex, uneven, and spontaneous care into a single verdict of one's moral work. Psychologically, this makes sense. Endings provide closure. Ethically, it is dangerous because moral life is not punctuated, it is cumulative. We often behave as if only the peaks and ending counts, whether it's grades, whether it's passing a bill, or whether it's a war. That is not moral reasoning. That is narrative convenience. In practice, especially in modern contexts, filial devotion is often socially judged by intensity of care at the end of life and the correctness or lavishness of funeral rites, which are precisely the peak at the end. Here, the peak and roll does not merely describe memory, it reshapes moral evaluation. We see this clearly in how societies evaluate caregiving, especially elder care. A child who is largely absent for decades may be remembered as filial if they perform devotion convincingly at the end. Conversely, a child who provided steady but unspectacular care may receive little recognition if the ending is abrupt, messy, or unceremonious. Overall, filial piety exposes how endings become moral alibis, allowing the remembering self and society to excuse long term neglect through a narratively satisfying conclusion. Contemporary empirical research supports this orientation. Studies of Chinese and Chinese American families show that filial piety operates as a motivational structure, shaping caregiving behavior, caregiver burden, and relational quality across years rather than moments. Stronger internalization of filial values correlates with lower perceived burden and more sustainable caregiving practices, suggesting that moral meaning is generated through consistency, not intensity. When peaks and endings dominate moral judgment, they distort incentives. Individuals may defer care, rationalizing neglect with the promise of a dramatic ending. I will show up when it matters. This logic transforms filial piety into a form of moral performativity, where visible gestures at the end outweigh invisible labor over time. This dynamic is not abstract. Many people experience a quiet dissonance, the sense that daily efforts, calling regularly, listen patiently, showing up without spectacle, carry little narrative weight. What lingers instead is the anxiety of the ending. Will I be there enough at the end? Will that be what counts? The anxiety reveals the internalization of the peak and logic. The fear is not having failed consistently, but of failing at the ending. The ending becomes the moment of judgment, rather than one moment among many. This helps explain why people often invest emotionally and financially in final acts. Funerals, less gestures, symbolic sacrifices, while underinvesting in the ordinary presence that actually structures relationships. Elders' daily experiences, loneliness, quiet, support, or long term neglect, are systematically erased when peaks and ends are the only things that are remembered. Qualitative research shows that while filial norms can motivate care, they also mask caregiver strain and elder vulnerability when attention is focused on symbolic moments rather than lived realities. The elder's experiencing self disappears beneath the remembering self's narrative. A strong counterargument holds that endings deserve special moral weight, particularly in Chinese culture. Scholars argue that funerary rites provide communal recognition of relationships, transform private grief into collective meaning, offer moral closure that stabilizes social memory, and allow expressions of Sha when structural constraints prevent daily caregiving. From this view, endings crystallize meaning and allow society to move forward. As philosopher Popla builds, endings are not moral failures, but integral parts of finite practices. A relationship does not lose its value because it ends. An ethical question is not whether something concludes, but how it is concluded. Endings on these views can be sites of care and meaning rather than mere verdicts on what came before. While rituals serve indispensable social and psychological functions, they do not serve the best as substitutes for evidence of sustained care. First, an ending can symbolically represent a relationship, but it cannot retroactively supply what was absent in lived time. Moral life unfolds in duration. Second, reliance on endings disproportionately benefits those with resources. Lavish funerals and visible rituals can be purchased, whereas years of care cannot be simulated. When endings dominate judgment, moral worth becomes vulnerable to inequality. Third, and most importantly, a moral system that depends on endings is structurally fragile. Endings are often uncontrollable. Sudden death, geographic separation, political or economic stability. If moral valuation hinges on the ending, then moral meaning becomes hostage to chance. This reveals the deeper flaw. The Pecan logic treats life as a story that must conclude well, rather than as a practice that must be lived well. This analysis suggests a broader philosophical conclusion. Peaks and endings should be understood as interpretive moments, despite how the peak end rule might affect society's memory perception, and not justifications of moral verdicts. It is not that the peaks and endings are dangerous, but that we let this memory stand in for truth. They erase the ethical significance of consistency, patience, and presence, the very qualities most essential to care, growth, and character. Filial piety, properly understood, resists this collapse. It insists that moral worth acquires quietly, often invisibly, and sometimes without narrative payoff. The Pecan Rule remains one of the most powerful insights into how human memory works, but it becomes a dangerous guide when it slips into moral judgment. By placing them together in dialogue, we can reflect something new about the nature of endings. Peaks and endings are psychologically powerful, but a meaningful life, especially a life of care, cannot be evaluated solely by its peaks and ends. Any framework that allows them to redeem negligence misunderstands both memory and morality. Filial piety reminds us of something countercultural and deeply unsettling, that the most important moral work often leaves no highlight reel. It happens in the middle, in repetition, in days that will never be remembered clearly. And perhaps the deeper challenge is this: to live in a way that remains meaningful, even if the ending does not cooperate.